Hello everyone, welcome back to AS and A-Level Biology with Dr. Demi. I am Dr. Demi, and in this video I will continue chapter 17 of the A-Level Biology syllabus, focusing specifically on natural selection. If you have just found this channel, please note that I am posting all the AS and A-Level content in chronological order, and I have used the playlist function on YouTube to organize these by chapter. So if you have a specific pain point, maybe a chapter that you just don't understand, you can simply go to the playlist, click on that chapter, and you will find all the videos for that chapter already recorded using notes from my classroom. I also have a playlist for past questions, so you might want to go there if you're preparing for your exams, just to see some of the past questions that I have walked through. In this video, I will focus on natural selection, like I said earlier, and tell you about how natural selection affects the allele frequencies within populations. In order to help you understand natural selection, I will use an analogy. Let's assume that you and three other people who are able to mate with each other are taken to a mansion. So let's say we put you in a penthouse, and in this penthouse there are 7 bedrooms and there are only 4 of you. Each one of you can have your own room. There's an unlimited supply of foods, there's an unlimited supply of everything that you would ever need, and you don't even have to worry about money or working. What will happen in that mansion after a while is that amongst the 4 of you, you would start to mate with each other. Why? Because you're in suitable environmental conditions. So in this case, that will result in what is called a population boom. You start to increase in number, and as you increase in number, certain factors start to come into play. The first factor that comes into play in this regard would be the competition for space. So when you first got into the mansion, there were 7 bedrooms and there were 4 of you. Even if you decided to become couples or whatever, the point is each of you had access to your own room if you wanted it. Now, as population starts to increase within the mansion, you find that people become more competitive for space. So say, for example, you guys become 10. There are 7 bedrooms, maybe 2 people in a room, that still seems fine. What happens when the population becomes 25 or 50? What will happen in that case is that certain factors start to creep into play. These factors can either be biotic or they can be abiotic. Biotic in the sense of predation, now if we're speaking about animals that are in the wild, competition for food, and also infection by pathogens. Because imagine if you were all in that crowded space and you had become 50 people in this penthouse I'm talking about. What will happen in such a case is that if one person gets ill, say for example they get the influenza virus, it's very easy for them to pass it around to people who are in the mansion with them. And that then means that there is a high chance of the population being cut off because of this virus being passed around. There are also abiotic factors such as water supply, for example. So you live in a mansion, you have access to hot water, but this hot water is limited, and for 4 people it's enough in a day. But say you're now 50 people, it means there is a competition for someone to get to the shower first so they don't shower with cold water. So water supply itself can become a source of competition, and organisms that are unable to adapt to that might die. Nutrient availability, the competition for food. So if when you first arrived at the mansion as 4 people, there was always a particular supply of vegetables and that supply did not change even when you became 50 people, what's going to happen is that there would be an issue with access to food, and that then causes fights amongst the population, and it causes some individuals who are unable to adapt to perhaps not eating for some time to die off. This is how natural selection plays in the natural environment. Animals that are in a suitable system, or even just people, not just animals, even people who are in a suitable system, suitable environmental conditions, tend to increase in number to unprecedented levels. However, as they increase in number, they start to invite biotic and abiotic factors that then result in natural selection taking its course. Now, in Australia in the 19th century, there was a rabbit explosion that happened. And what happened was the rabbits, when they got there were no predators for rabbits. There was a lot of food for them to eat, so they boomed in population. But after a while, supply of food started to become short. Just like I explained, increase in rabbit population, same supply of food. obviously there will be a short supply. Then predators started to notice that there were these rabbits that existed in their immediate environment and they could eat them and enjoy them. And so predators started to increase in number because the rabbits increased in number. In other words, predators will always increase wherever the prey are high in number. Transmission of diseases like myxomatosis was also something that played a role. In other words, because the rabbit population boomed and they were so high in number, it was easy for them to transmit pathogens to one another because of overcrowding. This is something similar that you might find, for example, with tuberculosis. If a person has tuberculosis and they're within a confined environment with many other people, there is a high chance of such a person transmitting the virus to those other people or the bacteria. So all of these factors come to a point where they reduce the rabbit population. Some rabbits would have died from a lack of food, some of them would have been killed by predators, some of them would have been killed by myxomatosis. And what this tells us is that natural selection will act on a population once it starts to reach its limit, which means that the rabbit population in Australia had increased to a certain limit where natural selection had to come into play. The rabbits that died from a lack of food would have been the rabbits that were unable to adapt to the fact that there was now a short supply of food. Those that were killed by predators would probably be the bright colored rabbits that can easily be seen. So for example, the white colored rabbits would easily be seen by a predator, so there is a chance that they would die. That is natural selection acting against them. Some of them would have died from myxomatosis, which is a disease, and this would have been possible only for those who were susceptible to the disease. Others would have developed some sort of resistance to the pathogen, and as a result of that, they would have survived as a result of natural selection. I hope this makes sense. If it doesn't, just post a question in the comments. Now, let's look at this, and I love this graph in particular from Encyclopedia Britannica. If you look at this here, this is the lynx, and the lynx is a predator of the snowshoe hare. So I'm just going to use a green marker here so that it's easy for you to see. Now, if you look at this, in 1855, the snowshoe hare started to increase in population. And as the snowshoe hare started to increase, the population of the lynx also seemed high. But as the snowshoe hare increased, decreased, look at what happened to its predator. And then there's a slight increase here, and when it has a boom, this is when the prey has a boom over here, you can see that there's also a boom in the predator. So this basically just shows us that the way the environment acts is to send a predator after the prey if the prey is increasing in number to a certain extent. That might be the population limit. So as environmental pressures increase, populations will start to decrease until a point where the environment is stable again. The point of natural selection is to achieve stability within the environment. So if an environment becomes overcrowded, or if it becomes, if the resources in it are extracted to a certain extent, there will be some kind of disaster that happens that then helps the environment stabilize itself again, and as a result stabilize the populations of the organisms that are living in it. In these cases, only the best adapted members of a population are able to survive and pass their genes to the next generation. There are features in certain animals that would increase chances of survival. An example is the agouti coat in rabbits. The agouti coat looks like a brown coat, and it's usually found in rabbits. I can't remember if it's brown or gray. I believe it's brown. It's like a brown coat that's found in rabbits, and these rabbits, so I'm going to pose this as a question to you that you can think about. If you take a brown rabbit and you put it in the woods, will that rabbit be easily seen by a predator? The answer to that is no, because the rabbit is camouflaged sort of by the environment. But if you take a brown rabbit and you take it to the North Pole and you leave it in the midst of snow, that rabbit will distinctly stand out, and as a result, if there was a predator close by, it would easily spot the rabbit. The agouti rabbit tends to have a higher chance of survival because it is not easily seen by a predator, compared to a white rabbit that can easily be seen by foxes and are likely to be killed. What this then means is that the white rabbit becomes endangered and is unable to pass its genes to the next generation. Of course, this is assuming the white rabbit lives in the wild or in the woods. Whereas the brown rabbit is able to pass its own genes along because it has a higher chance of survival. For you to mate and make offspring, you must first be alive. And so the rabbits that are able to survive the predators are the ones that will reproduce for the next generation. And as a result of that, they can shift what a population looks like. In this case, we say that the agouti rabbit is fit for the wild, while the white rabbit is not fit. The fitness of an organism is defined as its capacity to survive and transmit its genotype to its offspring. This is what fitness means. And you've probably heard the term survival of the fittest. It simply means that only those that are adapted to survive in certain environments will be able to do so. Now let's look at the forces of natural selection. Just like I said earlier, natural selection always tries to keep things the way they are, trying to ensure that the best adapted organisms in the populations are the ones that survive. And in this case, we call it a kind of stabilizing selection. Now, if you look at this graph here, you'll see that this is showing us body mass, okay, it's over a continuum, so numbers in population. Because this population here is usually is probably the very small population and this is a very big population, if there's going to be a selection pressure in terms of body mass, the small tiny organisms will likely be acted upon and the very large organisms would also easily be acted upon. What this means is that natural selection is trying to stabilize things and put them closer to what would be considered an optimum. And this is what we often refer to as stabilizing selection. So you can see here in B, this is what stabilizing selection looks like. You can also have what we call directional selection. Directional selection is what happens if a new environmental factor comes into play. In other words, if there's a new allele that comes into play, then it might change the direction of things. Let's say, for example, we have gray rabbits, we have agouti rabbits, which I think are brown, and we also have, and all of a sudden, we start making white rabbits. Because of a mutation, for example. And this is somewhere, let's say in the wild, not in the wild, in the North Pole. So covered with snow, and these white rabbits and these brown rabbits rather and the gray rabbits have been hunted for quite a long time. But now there's a mutation in the genes because this population needs to survive, and some of them start to give birth to white rabbits that are easily masked. What this is going to do is it will change the frequency of alleles. Before, the population was known to be gray or brown. Now, with the entrance of a white rabbit, the white rabbit will likely be masked by the snowy environment, and as a result of that will not be seen by predators. What this means is that there is a high chance of the white rabbit surviving in the North Pole, and that means it would make more offspring. And that means it will also change the direction of the population. So most of the population going forward would likely become white. You also have what we call disruptive selection, and disruptive selection is a type of selection where two extremes of a population are favored. In this case, what it simply means is that if we have large organisms and we have small organisms, they are the ones that are favored within the environment, and those that are middle-sized are the ones that are acted upon and affected by selection pressures such as predators, competition for food, and all of those other things. So just to zoom in a little bit more on directional selection, where I've said that it's basically a certain part of the population is acted upon by the selection pressure, and it results in a shift in the genotypes that are passed on to the next generation. And I've used the rabbit coat color as an example, and also just letting you know that a new allele emerging can be very harmful or it might not be. So in this case, I often like to use sickle cell anemia as an example, but we will discuss it as we go on in this chapter. But just having a new allele can then result in the frequency of genotypes that are passed on to the next generation as the selected allele or the preferred allele starts to reproduce. These are the factors that form the basis for evolution, and this is how basically populations evolve. So again, just like I said, using the example of the white rabbits in the North Pole, if we have brown rabbits and we have white rabbits in a population, and these are all located in the North Pole, and predators also exist there, the brown rabbits would likely die off first. first, because the white rabbits are the ones that would be camouflaged. And what this then means is that evolution would favor the white rabbit, and the white rabbit will increase in population. So these are some of the ways that selection results in the evolution of species. Now, just to show you some examples of natural selection and how it has resulted in evolution. Antibiotic resistance is one of the ways that we have evolution impacting our society today. Because we have abused antibiotics to a certain extent, antibiotic resistance has increased amongst bacteria. And because the bacteria that's resistant to an antibiotic are more likely to survive, they are the ones that pass their genes on to their offspring, which means they pass on the antibiotic resistance. And so those are the traits that are favored amongst the bacterial population. Sickle cell anemia is also another issue. With sickle cell anemia, what you would find is that it is very common in areas where malaria is endemic. So in regions of West Africa and some parts of India, you would find that sickle cell anemia is a very common condition. And what happened with sickle cell anemia was there was a mutation in the genes that resulted in the red blood cells becoming sickle-shaped. When red blood cells are sickle-shaped, mosquitoes are less likely to feed on such blood, and such people are less likely to get malaria. And so as a result of that, we have now had an evolution of individuals who carry the sickle cell allele or who are sickle cell anemic because they are homozygous recessive for that trait. So this is a way in which selection has resulted in evolution. Truly, these people don't get affected by malaria, but it has sort of resulted in a mutation that might be fatal for some if they don't have access to adequate care. The black-peppered moth is the last example of how natural selection has resulted in the evolution of a new species. Back in the day, the moths used to be this color, and they used to be pale, and they were nicely hidden. They could be camouflaged in the woods, for example, because their wings sort of matched with flowers, with barks, and all of those things. So they were easily disguised and were not eaten. However, when industrial areas started to develop, what was noticed was that some of these moths were coming out black and they were not pale anymore. What happened was that the industrial areas had turned many of the buildings around them black because of the release of smoke. And due to that, the pale moths were no longer hidden. They could be easily seen in these environments because against the black background, their pale wings really stood out. And so predators could easily identify and hurt them. So that resulted in a new allele. Again, natural selection just coming into play. A mutation resulted in a new allele that then made these moths black. And so you would find that in the industrial areas, you're likely to find a black colored moth. But if you go into the woods, if you go into nature, you're likely to find a pale colored one. And so this is how natural selection has been influencing evolution. I'm going to stop on this slide about genetic drift and founder effect. I often see questions asking students to define this, or where there is a situation that's posed to students and they're asked to tell if it's genetic drift or some kind of founder effect. Genetic drift is a change in allele frequency that occurs because some organisms in a population choose to reproduce and others do not, and it's purely by chance. So if, for example, going back to the idea of 4 of you being selected and put in a mansion or in a penthouse, and you're told you can choose to reproduce with each other or you may not. If 2 of you choose to reproduce and the other 2 do not, the alleles of the 2 who have chosen to reproduce would be the ones that continue to be passed on within that mansion, and as a result of that, the mansion will be populated by those who have chosen to reproduce. This is called genetic drift. Genetic drift is basically indicating that even though there might be an abundance of genetic variation, that doesn't mean that that variation will be represented in the next generation because some organisms of the present generation might not reproduce. That is what genetic drift simply refers to. Founder effect, on the other hand, is a situation whereby a small group separates from a large population, and when they separate from a large population to go and form their own habitat or form their own group, what's going to happen is that their allele frequencies will be affected by genetic drift. Again, using you as an example, four of you, if you decide to just move on your own, that's genetic drift. Okay, you're separating already from the larger population, and then only two of you choose to reproduce, and that results in those two alleles, the alleles of those two individuals, being the ones that are passed on. That means that those two individuals become the founders of the new population, and that is what we refer to as the founder effect. So it is in a recently isolated small population, and it takes a different direction from the original population from which it was separated. I'm going to stop here now, but I hope that you understood all of those. If you still find them confusing, just post a question in the comments, and I'm sure someone from the learning community will get back to you. On the next video, I will show you how to apply the Hardy-Weinberg principle to a problem that you might be given, and how you can use it to determine the frequency of alleles within a population. Thank you so much for watching. Until the next video, goodbye.